By December 1944, the European front was frozen in more than one sense. Snow covered shattered villages, forests, and trenches, muting explosions, but not the tension beneath them. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, poorly supplied, and painfully aware that the war was nearing its end, even as it continued to claim lives each day. Christmas approached not as a celebration, but as a reminder of distance, from home, from peace, from the lives they once knew. In scattered sectors of the front, particularly in quiet or confused zones where lines were fluid, an unspoken pause emerged. It was never announced, never recorded in orders, and never guaranteed. Gunfire slowed. Patrols stayed closer to their lines. Soldiers listened instead of shooting, waiting to see if the silence would hold. In some places it did, briefly, cautiously, and without trust. Christmas carols drifted across the cold air, sung softly at first, then answered from the opposite side. The words differed by language, but the melodies were familiar. For a moment, enemy voices sounded unmistakably human. Men who had spent months reducing one another to targets and silhouettes now imagined faces behind the sound. No one crossed openly at first. The memory of betrayal was too strong, and the rules of war still applied the moment trust had failed. In a few locations, small gestures followed. A helmet raised on a rifle, a shouted greeting, a wave, sometimes a cigarette tossed across a narrow stretch of frozen ground. These were not grand acts of reconciliation, but fragile signals of restraint. Each man knew that the truce could end instantly, either by command or by a single nervous shot. The danger did not disappear. It was simply acknowledged and held at bay. The reality of Christmas on the front line was harsh. There were no decorations beyond improvised candles or scraps of greenery. Rations were thin, boots were wet, and frostbite was as much an enemy as artillery. Yet even under these conditions, soldiers clung to ritual. Letters were reread, prayers whispered, and memories revisited with painful clarity. The temporary quiet allowed thoughts usually suppressed by survival to surface. Officers often tolerated these pauses without formally recognizing them. Command understood the risk of discipline breaking down, but also the limits of human endurance. By morning, in most sectors, the war resumed. Orders were followed. Weapons were raised again. The truce left no official trace, and many participants never spoke of it afterward. It existed only in memory, shared between men who understood how rare and dangerous such moments were. The Christmas Truce of 1944 was not a story of peace achieved, but of restraint chosen. It did not stop the war, delay offensives, or change outcomes. What it revealed instead was the persistence of humanity under extreme pressure. Even in a conflict defined by total war, ideology, and destruction, there were moments when soldiers recognized something familiar in the enemy. These moments did not last, but their impact endured, quietly, in the memories of those who survived the winter. Silence arrived without warning. One moment, the air carried the distant crack of rifles and the dull rhythm of artillery. The next, it settled into an uneasy stillness that felt heavier than noise. Soldiers lifted their heads from frozen ground and ruined buildings, listening closely, unsure whether the pause was deliberate or simply the calm before another barrage. In war, silence was rarely trusted, and yet it demanded attention. Across the front line, men adjusted to the absence of sound with caution. Fingers stayed close to triggers. Eyes searched familiar shapes in the mist. And no one moved too quickly. The routines of survival had been built around constant danger, and without it, Time seemed distorted. Minutes stretched and the smallest movement felt amplified. The stillness created space for thought, something the front line usually denied. In that quiet, the presence of the enemy became strangely intimate. Without gunfire to enforce distance, soldiers became aware of voices, footsteps, and even laughter carried by the cold air. The line separating sides felt thinner, less absolute. Men imagined the routines unfolding on the other side. Hands warming around cups, boots being adjusted, letters being unfolded and folded again. The enemy was no longer an abstraction, but a parallel existence. Small acts tested the silence. A single shout, a wave of a hand, a figure standing briefly in the open, daring the moment to hold. Each gesture carried risk, and each depended on restraint being shared. Trust was never complete, only provisional, renewed second by second. The guns remained close, loaded and ready, reminders that the pause could end at any time. The quiet exposed exhaustion that noise had concealed. Bodies ached, nerves trembled, and memories surfaced without invitation. Soldiers thought of kitchens, streets, and voices far away, images that felt almost unreal after months of mud and smoke. The silence did not bring comfort so much as clarity, forcing each man to confront what had been endured and what still lay ahead. Commanders observed from a distance, weighing discipline against reality. Officially, nothing had changed. Orders remained, objectives unchanged. Yet there was an understanding, rarely spoken aloud, that the men at the front were not machines. The pause was tolerated because it was human, even if it was temporary and fragile. When the guns eventually spoke again, the silence dissolved as suddenly as it had appeared. The front returned to its familiar violence, and the brief suspension faded into memory. But for those who experienced it, the moment lingered. It became proof that even within the machinery of war, there were instants when choice replaced momentum, and humanity, however briefly, interrupted the noise. Night settled slowly over no man's land, softening the torn wire and frozen craters beneath a thin layer of snow. Fires burned low in dugouts, and men huddled close for warmth, listening to the familiar sounds of wind moving across an empty space that usually screamed with gunfire. Then a voice rose into the darkness, tentative at first, carrying a melody shaped by memory rather than confidence. The song was a carol, simple and unaccompanied. It drifted upward and outward, crossing trenches and shell holes, floating where bullets normally travelled. No one could see the singer, only hear the sound echo across the cold air. The tune was instantly recognisable, even to those who did not share the same language. It belonged to a world before uniforms and orders, before maps divided fields into killing zones. For a long moment, there was no response. Soldiers waited, uncertain whether the song would draw gunfire or laughter. Fingers tightened on rifles, and heads stayed low. Then, from the opposite side, another voice answered. The words were different, but the melody matched. The song returned across the open ground, transformed but familiar, as if the land itself were carrying it back. The exchange continued verse by verse, sound moving where bodies could not. Men leaned out of cover to listen, some smiling, others frozen in disbelief. The carols stitched together fragments of shared culture that the war had not entirely destroyed. In that moment, no man's land became something else. Not a battlefield, but a corridor of sound connecting separated lives. The singing altered behaviour. Weapons were lowered, not set aside, but no longer raised. A few figures stood where they could be seen, silhouettes against snow and darkness, trusting the music to protect them. Each note was a risk, Each pause a test. The carols did not erase danger, they suspended it, holding violence at bay through mutual restraint. For many soldiers, the songs reopened memories long buried by necessity. Family gatherings, church halls, candlelight, and voices now distant returned with painful clarity. The contrast was sharp and disorienting. The front line had stripped life down to survival, and the carols briefly restored its emotional weight. Tears were not uncommon, though few admitted it. The singing faded gradually, not with a final chorus, but with exhaustion and cold. Silence returned, altered by what had just passed through it. When the guns eventually resumed, the melodies did not disappear. They lingered in memory, reminders that even across no man's land, something fragile and human could still travel unarmed, carried only by breath and belief. The first meetings happened cautiously, almost by accident. A figure stepped into the open, hands visible, posture tense, ready to retreat at the slightest sign of danger. No signal had been given, no permission granted. The absence of orders made every movement heavier, every decision personal. War had trained these men to obey commands. Yet here they acted on instinct, curiosity, and a fragile sense that the moment demanded restraint. No man's land, usually defined by death, became a narrow space of negotiation. Soldiers advanced slowly, boots crunching on frozen ground, eyes fixed on one another rather than on rifles. The distance between enemies felt unreal, as if the rules governing it had quietly shifted. Each step forward carried risk, not just of betrayal, but of punishment should the moment be witnessed by the wrong eyes. Words came hesitantly, short phrases, broken sentences, gestures filling gaps where language failed. Names were rarely exchanged, but smiles appeared, cautious and brief. Men pointed to photographs tucked into pockets, mimed drinking or smoking, laughed at shared discomfort. These encounters were not political statements or philosophical debates. They were practical, human exchanges shaped by cold, exhaustion, and the sudden recognition of similarity. Gifts changed hands in small, almost symbolic forms. Cigarettes, bits of chocolate, canned food, anything that could be spared. Each object carried meaning far beyond its value. To give something to the enemy was to acknowledge him as a person rather than a target. These moments unfolded without ceremony, unrecorded and unofficial, sustained only by mutual silence and restraint. The lack of orders was precisely what made the meetings possible. No hierarchy controlled the interaction, no doctrine dictated behavior. Decisions were made face to face, stripped of ideology. Soldiers understood that this freedom was temporary and dangerous. At any moment, an officer's shout or a distant gunshot could shatter the illusion. The knowledge of impermanence sharpened the intensity of each exchange. Some men spoke later of an unspoken rule that governed these encounters. Nothing that could change the war was discussed. There were no plans, no intelligence, no promises. The meetings existed outside strategy. They were pauses, not negotiations. The boundary between sides remained intact, even as it was momentarily softened by proximity and shared vulnerability. When the encounters ended, men returned to their lines without ceremony. No goodbyes, no final gestures. The war resumed its structure, its noise, its demands. Yet those who had crossed the space without orders carried something back with them, a memory that resisted simplification. They had met the enemy not as an idea or a uniform, but as a man who had stepped forward just as uncertain into the same cold silence. The exchange often began with a simple gesture. A hand raised slowly, fingers pinched around a cigarette, held up as an offer rather than a challenge. In a war defined by distance and destruction, this small object carried unusual weight. Cigarettes were scarce, valued, and deeply personal. Offering one to the enemy meant more than sharing tobacco. It meant suspending hostility, if only for a moment. Men stepped closer, cautiously, reading faces for signs of deception. Boots pressed into frozen mud where shells had landed days earlier. Rifles remained slung but not forgotten. When a cigarette was accepted, the act felt almost ceremonial. Matches were struck, flames briefly illuminating tired eyes and unshaven faces. The light revealed what uniforms had hidden: youth, fear, and exhaustion shared on both sides. Smoking together created an unexpected intimacy. The rhythm of inhaling and exhaling slowed breathing, easing nerves trained for sudden violence. Silence was no longer threatening. It became companionable. Men leaned against broken earthworks or stood awkwardly, unsure where to place their hands now that they were not aiming weapons. For a few minutes, the front line felt less like a boundary and more like a shared shelter from the cold. Conversation followed naturally, though often in fragments. A word here, a gesture there. Language barriers mattered less than tone and expression. Laughter emerged, surprised and quiet, usually at the absurdity of the situation. Someone mimed the cold, another complained about boots, another gestured toward the sky. These were not stories of ideology or strategy, but of discomfort and survival. The cigarette itself became a symbol of equality. Rank dissolved, backgrounds blurred. Each man held the same object, burned by the same flame, consumed at the same pace. For soldiers accustomed to strict hierarchy and dehumanizing routines, this shared act restored a sense of balance. No one was giving orders. No one was obeying. They were simply present together. The danger never disappeared. Every shared cigarette existed under the shadow of consequences. Soldiers knew that if seen by the wrong person, these moments could lead to punishment or worse. This awareness sharpened their focus, making each exchange deliberate and restrained. Nothing excessive, nothing that could not be denied later. Humanity was expressed quietly, without spectacle. When the cigarettes were finished, the spell weakened. Men crushed the butts into the earth, a small, synchronized motion marking the end of the pause. Without ceremony, they stepped back toward their lines. The war waited, unchanged and impatient. Yet the act lingered. In the memory of shared smoke and shared silence, the enemy had briefly ceased to be an abstraction, replaced by a man who had accepted a cigarette and returned the gesture with nothing more threatening than a nod. The war did not stop by command. It hesitated. Somewhere between orders and instinct, the machinery slowed, its gears grinding less loudly than usual. Guns remained in place, artillery stood ready, and maps still marked objectives. Yet something intangible interrupted the rhythm. The pause was not official, not acknowledged, and not secure. It existed only because enough men chose not to pull the trigger. This hesitation spread unevenly along the front. In some sectors, nothing changed. In others, firing dwindled to scattered shots, then fell silent. Soldiers listened closely, attuned to any sign that the lull was an illusion. The absence of noise felt unnatural, as if the war itself were holding its breath. Men adjusted their routines, unsure how to behave without the constant pressure of immediate danger. Within this quiet, individuals reclaimed small choices usually denied to them. A helmet removed, a head raised above the parapet, a step taken into open ground. These acts were insignificant in strategic terms but profound in personal risk. Each gesture tested whether the pause would be shared or punished. Survival depended not on firepower, but on mutual restraint. The front line revealed its human scale. Without explosions to flatten perspective, distances shortened, faces became visible, voices carried, soldiers recognized familiar sounds, coughing, laughter, curses muttered in frustration. The enemy was no longer an abstract position on a map, but a collection of men enduring the same cold and fatigue. Command structures remained intact, watching from a distance. Officers did not authorize the pause, but many understood it. Discipline had its limits, and exhaustion its own authority. Intervening too forcefully risked breaking something fragile. The war machine functioned because humans sustained it. And in that moment, its operators needed space. The pause did not dismantle ideology or erase fear. Weapons were never far from reach. Trust was provisional, renewed with every minute of silence. Everyone involved understood that the war could restart instantly, triggered by an order, a misunderstanding, or a single nervous act. The machinery was idling, not dismantled. When the fighting resumed, it did so with the same efficiency as before. Yet the interruption left a trace. Those who experienced it carried the knowledge that the war's momentum was not absolute. For a brief moment, the machinery depended on human choice, and human choice had slowed it. The pause on the front line did not happen unnoticed. Officers were aware of the silence, of patrols that failed to report contact, of weapons that remained unfired longer than expected. Reports came in vague and incomplete, shaped carefully to avoid drawing attention. No one formally acknowledged what was happening, yet few pretended ignorance. The absence of noise spoke loudly enough. Commanders faced a quiet dilemma. Doctrine demanded discipline, obedience, and constant readiness. Any unauthorized contact with the enemy was technically a violation. Yet the men under their command were exhausted, worn thin by months of combat and cold. Enforcing the letter of the rules risked breaking morale at a moment when endurance mattered more than punishment. Many officers chose caution over confrontation. Looking the other way required its own form of authority. Orders were not rescinded, but enforcement was delayed. Patrols were postponed. Artillery schedules slipped quietly. Official logs remained clean, recording nothing unusual. The truce existed only in the gaps between reports, sustained by what was left unwritten. Silence became an administrative tool as much as a battlefield condition. Not all officers agreed. Some issued sharp reminders, tightened discipline, or ordered limited displays of force to reassert control. In sectors where command intervened directly, the pause ended quickly. Yet even there, the memory of restraint lingered. The contrast between choice and command was impossible to ignore once it had been experienced. For officers who tolerated the moment, the decision carried risk. Careers depended on reliability and control, not empathy. A superior might interpret silence as weakness or negligence. Yet many had served long enough to understand the cost of unrelenting pressure. Leadership wasn't only about issuing orders, but about knowing when not to. The men sensed this restraint from above. The lack of punishment was itself a signal. It allowed soldiers to step back without fear of immediate reprisal, reinforcing the fragile balance that kept the pause alive. Trust flowed upward as well as across the lines, unspoken but deeply felt. When normal operations resumed, officers reasserted authority without explanation. The machinery of command clicked back into place, leaving no official trace of what had occurred. But those who looked the other way carried their own memory of it. They had witnessed a moment when leadership meant restraint and silence became a form of command. Faith survived on the front line in forms stripped of ceremony. There were no grand services or polished rituals, only whispered prayers, folded scraps of paper, and quiet gestures made in moments of fear. Soldiers carried faith not as doctrine, but as habit and memory. In the cold and uncertainty of the front, belief became personal, shaped by exhaustion rather than instruction. Fatigue settled deeper than hunger or cold. It was not simply physical, but mental and emotional, a weariness that dulled fear and sharpened longing. Men moved through routines automatically, their bodies responding while their minds drifted elsewhere. Sleep came in fragments. Letters were reread until words lost clarity. The war demanded constant alertness, but offered no relief, eroding the boundaries that once held discipline firm. In this state, the desire for peace was not ideological. It did not arise from debates about victory or defeat, justice or cause. It came from the simplest need: rest. Peace meant silence, warmth, and the chance to stop watching the horizon for threats. It was imagined not as an end to the war, but as a pause within it, a moment when survival did not require constant tension. Faith and fatigue intersected in unexpected ways. Some men prayed for protection, others for escape, others for forgiveness, for what they had done or failed to do. Prayer became less about belief in outcomes and more about expressing limits. It acknowledged that strength had run out and that endurance alone could not sustain them indefinitely. The quiet moments on the front line allowed these needs to surface. When the guns fell silent, even briefly, space opened for reflection. Men looked at one another and recognized the same strain etched into unfamiliar faces. The enemy appeared less as an obstacle to be destroyed and more as another exhausted presence, enduring the same conditions under a different flag. This recognition did not erase loyalty or obligation. Soldiers remained committed to their units and orders. Yet the pause revealed something deeper than allegiance, a shared human threshold beyond which violence lost meaning. Faith, stripped to its core, and fatigue, stripped of pride, met in the same realization. The need for peace expressed itself quietly, without slogans or demands. It existed in lowered weapons, restrained actions, and unspoken agreements not to escalate. These moments did not change the course of the war, but they revealed the cost of sustaining it. In the intersection of faith, fatigue, and restraint, the front line briefly acknowledged what the machinery of war could not, how close its operators were to breaking. The truce was never spoken aloud as an agreement, yet everyone understood its limits. It belonged to the night, to darkness and exhaustion, not to daylight or command. Men acted as if dawn already carried an ending written into it. The pause was borrowed time, fragile and conditional, sustained by the shared knowledge that it could not last. As hours passed, the front line settled into an uneasy calm. Fires burned low, and conversations faded into silence. Soldiers remained close to their positions, careful not to push the moment too far. No one suggested plans or promises. The truce depended on restraint, and restraint depended on not naming what was happening. To acknowledge it openly would have made it real, and therefore vulnerable. The coming of morning changed how the quiet was felt. Even before the sky lightened, men sensed the shift. Shadows shortened, visibility improved, and the protective cover of darkness weakened. With light came awareness of distance, uniforms, and positions. The conditions that allowed ambiguity began to disappear, replaced by clarity that demanded separation. Some soldiers prepared themselves physically and mentally for the return of violence. Weapons were checked discreetly, gear adjusted, helmets fastened. These actions were deliberate but unhurried, performed without hostility. There was no rush to be the first to break the silence. Each man waited, hoping someone else would be forced to make the first move. In the final moments before dawn, glances were exchanged across the open ground. There were no gestures, no words. The truce had exhausted its meaning. What remained was acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that the pause had been real, even if it was temporary. Nothing had been resolved, but something had been shared. When firing resumed, it did so without celebration or anger. The war returned as duty, not as passion. The night's restraint did not weaken resolve, but it altered memory. Those who had lived through the truce carried the knowledge that violence was not continuous by necessity, but by choice reinforced by circumstance. The dawn did not erase what had happened. It simply marked its boundary. The truce ended as expected, not because it failed, but because it was never meant to survive daylight. Its power lay in its impermanence, in the fact that for a few hours the war had paused by human decision alone. Christmas arrived without authority, without strategy, and without permission. It carried no orders and offered no protection. Yet, for a brief stretch of time, it disrupted the logic of the front. The war remained in place, trenches, weapons, objectives all unchanged, but its grip loosened. Men who had been trained to respond instantly to threat hesitated, guided by something older and quieter than command. The day unfolded differently from the start. Firing slowed, then stopped in places where it normally never did. Soldiers rose from dugouts expecting violence and found uncertainty instead. The routines of war stalled. No one announced a ceasefire, yet no one rushed to break the silence. Christmas did not end the conflict, but it interrupted its momentum, forcing the machinery to pause. Across frozen ground, signs of life appeared. A voice singing, a figure standing where no one should stand. A shared glance held longer than usual. These moments were small, but they accumulated. Each act of restraint made the next one possible. The war depended on continuous action. Christmas introduced hesitation, and hesitation weakened the rhythm that sustained it. Faith played its part, but not as doctrine. Christmas carried memories of home, warmth, and ritual that had nothing to do with victory or defeat. For many soldiers, the day reawakened identities buried beneath uniform and survival instinct. The enemy did not disappear, but he became secondary to the memory of something shared beyond the battlefield. The front line transformed into a space of recognition. Soldiers crossed boundaries that maps insisted were absolute. They exchanged words, food, cigarettes, and silence. None of this altered the strategic situation, yet it altered perception. The enemy was no longer a faceless threat, but a presence shaped by the same cold, hunger, and longing. Officers watched and measured. Some intervened. Others allowed the moment to pass, understanding its limits. Christmas could not be allowed to rewrite the war, but it was allowed to interrupt it. The day imposed a different authority, one rooted, not in hierarchy, but in collective restraint. By nightfall, the pause began to thin. The war waited patiently, certain of its return. Yet Christmas had already done something irreversible. It had shown that violence was not inevitable every hour, that even in total war there were moments when humanity asserted itself without orders. The fighting would resume, but for one day, Christmas had defeated the war, not by ending it, but by proving it could be stopped.